there. I'm Indira Samarasekara.
And I'm Martha Piper. And we're so glad you are joining us today for our podcast, She's Got Nerve.
This podcast is based upon our book Nerve, which we wrote several years ago to assist women who are leaders who are aspiring to lead by interviewing extraordinary men and recording their unique and authentic personal stories about how they develop the nerve to become leaders in their respective environments. We hope to learn more about what it takes to lead as a woman in today's world.
You know, Indira, nerve, it's such an interesting concept. I think, we've come to believe it's a bit different than courage, which we've interpreted as a quality of mind or spirit to face pain or agony. Nerve, on the other hand, involves not only the ability to confront difficulty, but also requires one to act, thereby distinguishing leaders who back away from conflict or who are afraid to act from those leaders who summon the strength and the nerve to actually confront adversity by taking a position and doing something. Maybe it's because women are often viewed as being collegial, consultative, compassionate, nice people. But what we have variously observed is women sometimes lack nerve. Nerve to be true to yourself, nerve to take a path less traveled, nerve to go first, nerve to act decisively, nerve to redefine yourself. And yet, so often, Indira, the term nerve is used pejoratively when applied to women, like, the nerve of her, or she's got a lot of nerve. I find that so interesting, don't you? Because, we found that nerve is something that is required to lead rather than something that where women are not entitled to exhibit.
So let's get right to it. What a treat it is today to have a conversation with Lisa Coleman, the first woman and the first Black person to be president of Adler University, a private graduate studies university dedicated to educating practitioners who will lead social change and create a more just society. Founded in Chicago in 1952 to continue the work of Alfred Adler, a physician and psychotherapist who emphasized the individual's need to engage with community and to create positive social change. In addition to the Chicago campus, Adler University also has a second campus in Vancouver, making it unique in educating graduate students in both the United States and Canada. Dr. Coleman earned a bachelor's degree in sociology and anthropology at Denison University in Ohio and her master's degree from Ohio State University. She received a PhD in social and cultural analysis and American Studies at New York University. Prior to assuming the presidency, she held administrative positions at Tufts University and Harvard, and was the first senior vice president for global inclusion and strategy innovation at NYU. What a treat it is today to be able to have a conversation with Lisa Coleman, a trailblazer and an academic leader.
Thank
Hi,
you,
Lisa.
Indira. Hello. Thank you, Indira. Thank you, Martha. It is a pleasure to be here with you all today. Two pioneers in your own right and two wonderful leaders. So thank you for having me today.
Well, it's very, very special to be able to connect with you, to now hear your stories and learn more about what inspired you to follow the career path you have developed. Indira and I, are fascinated with how women get to where they are, what inspires them, and what factors influence their decisions to lead. I read recently that numerous women influenced your life trajectory in higher education, including your grandmother, my goodness, who broke barriers and rules, and your mother, who became the first Black woman president of the American Business Women's Association. My goodness, in the early 1980s. Indira and I are fascinated by this, as so many of the women leaders we have interviewed to date have mentioned the role their fathers played in their career decisions, with very few, if any, acknowledging their mothers. Could you maybe share with us how these two women and other women have had a strong impact on your journey?
Yes, absolutely, Martha. And I find that so interesting. I say that my father provided the pathway in many ways because he supported the women in his life. But my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was a jazz musician who traveled between New York City and Chicago during 1920s. And so she was born in the late 1800s. She went to college. And so she went to a college called Philander Smith. She was born in Little Rock, Arkansas. And her mother, my great grandmother, would move to Chicago. And then as my grandmother would grow up, she would then learn to play the piano. And so as a child, she would regale me of stories of people like Al Capone and the Nicholas brothers and these performers that she knew. And she used to say, I didn't like Nat King Cole so much, but his daughter was great. And so there were these stories, and I didn't know these people were important. These are just the stories of your childhood. And I say that I didn't know my parents or my grandparents were radical in that my grandmother went to college as a Black woman in the early 1900s. That didn't seem radical to me. It just seemed normal. And so it's not until I grow up that I realize a lot of the differentiation in terms of my own familial background. She would educate and provide education for her two children, my uncle and my mother. And my mother would go to Hunter Day School, which at the time was a girls' school, really later becomes a college in New York City and really focused on the health sciences. But my mother would regale me of stories that she was part of an organization called the Dorothy Height Leadership Program. And my mother was also become a dancer, and she would win the Charleston contest for New York City, which was very fun. And so I
Wow.
like to say that I come from a family that's very artistic, but also scientific. My mother went to school and then would become a scientist. She first became an accountant and then became a computer scientist and went back to school in her 40s, and then would become probably it's not until I see the movie Hidden Figures, and then I was like, Mom, have you seen this movie? I think you should see it because I think you might have some relationship to you. So again, as I say, you don't know until later in life, and you realize that these things matter. And so what my mother and grandmother did was surround me with women. And I think this was perhaps rarer than I realized as a young person. My mother would always talk about how she went to school with someone by the name of Audre Lorde, who was a leader. Audre Lorde was 2 years older than my mother in school, and Audre Lorde went to Hunter. And so Audre Lorde, as you may know, becomes a very well-known feminist leader. That my mother always says she wished she had been friends with her, but she was not. They were all very smart, but she wasn't necessarily smart enough to do that. And so I think what she learned in life was that you needed women to support you and networks. Her best friend, my godmother, would move next door to her when she was 7 years old, and my godmother was 4, and they would be friends until my godmother died at 81. And so I would spend my life, my godmother became a bench scientist at Case Western Reserve University, and she would then do cancer research and research on diabetes. My mother's other friend, Ruth Thompson, was a social worker turned professor, and then would become a professor at Allegheny University. My mother's other friend, and I'm going to quote Adler in a moment, and I'm going to wrap up these comments. My mother died recently, and she died last year at the age of 92. One of her best friends was a woman by the name of Gloria. Gloria was an Italian, a woman of Italian descent who worked with my mother. But we never knew how Gloria and my mother became friends. So Gloria dies 2 months after my mother's life celebration in November of last year. Her daughter is calling us. They can't figure out the passwords to her computer, and the passwords are my mother's name.
Wow.
I'm shocked by this. And Melanie, the daughter, tells us this story. My mother, when my mother was a leader, because how she becomes the Businesswomen Association is because she leads these projects, these what are called information systems projects. When companies would buy other companies, she was in charge of merging those computer systems. So a bank like Bank of America might buy Fleet, and then she would be in charge of making sure those systems talk to each other. This young Italian woman worked for my mother. And unfortunately, she came from a disenfranchised background. She got to work and people were making fun of her clothes. My mother took her out. This almost makes me want to cry. I did not know this story until about a month ago. My mother took her out during the lunch hour and bought her clothes.
Wow.
They become friends for life. Gloria then dies 2 months after my mother. She was at her service, and I only know Gloria as one of my aunties, as we used to call them. And so I say that my mother not only surrounded me with people who were truly dynamic and talented, but people who were in struggle and people who we could learn from, and that curiosity and the developmental processes of life and the struggles that we go through. She always would ask this question: who are you going to be to each other?
Wow.
And so
Wow.
for me, that is where I think I've learned so much, and I am indebted to my mother and my grandmother.
Extra.
Indira, when I listen to Lisa, she reminds me, her story about her mother reminds me of the story you have about your father. Your father regaled you with all sorts of ideas and thoughts and people and stories about aspirational thinking. I mean, there's a similarity to this.
No
Yeah.
question.
And there's this quote by Alfred Adler, of course, the institution where I work, and it says, quote, "We learn in friendship to look with the eyes of another person, to listen with her ears, and to feel with her heart," end quote. And I think what my mother understood is that we needed friendship, deep
Yeah.
friendships, and deep understandings of each other. And it sounds like your father did as well. And that would lead us to greater empathy and greater possibility together.
Well, what's remarkable about your story, Lisa, was that, your mother and your grandmother grew up in a society where there wasn't an easy path, right, for them to succeed. I mean, I just read Drew Faust's book on 1950s America, and I was gobsmacked. I came from a third world country, but a country that had been colonized by the British, and women had far more opportunities, believe it or not. And that's where my father, acquired his aspirational, views.
Mm-hmm.
So remarkable. Your family has been remarkable, very inspiring. So, in addition to family, of course, we're tended to be affected by others. And this is, we all get help from our friends and colleagues. And your stories of your mother and grandmother having special friends, reflects that. And it truly does take a village. Upon reflection, are there one or two leaders who influenced you? Are there people who you knew or just admired, who inspired you or led by example that you now recognize as being instrumental in your leadership experience? Like, how important is it, do you believe, for all of us to have people who demonstrate through their actions what great leadership is?
Well, thank you very much for that question. So I'll start where you ended. I think it's tremendously important. I think that we all need models of leadership, and we also need models of leadership in struggle. So sometimes we think of leadership as perfect, that leader who's led a movement and it's all perfect and wrapped up nicely in a bow. And we quote these people, and I'm even using some quotes here today. But I think that it's important to understand that leaders grow and they develop over time. And so when I was young, again, my parents would take me to different lectures and programs, museums, etc. And one of the people that they took me to see early, I was very, very young, and it was a man by the name of James Baldwin. James Baldwin is a writer, very well known as an activist in the United States, an expat who moves to Paris. And really, I think one of the most beneficial things about Baldwin is that he was curious, a learner, and really engaged in what we think about as constructive criticism, and talked about his love for America, even in the criticism of it. So to go back to thinking about how do we truly become a democracy, and in struggle, what does that look like? And so one of Baldwin's quotes is, quote, "The world is before you, and you need not take it as it was or leave it as it was when you came in," end quote. And it's a quote that's guided my life, because I think that we can change the world, not as individuals necessarily. Sure, we can drop some things in the pond and ripple effects, but I think in collaboration, we can change the world. And so there's another person who probably was even more beneficial, because I discover her when I'm in college. And her name is Toni Morrison. Yes, that's right,
she comes from
Martha.
my hometown,
I know,
Lisa.
I know. And remember, I'm
Lorraine.
from the great border state of Ohio
I
too,
know,
Martha. So
I know. I
yes,
know.
and so
Tell
Lorraine,
me how you see Toni Morrison affecting you, because I
yes, and
find her to be incredibly fascinating for me.
incredibly fascinating. And so this is where I think this is where there's a shift. And so in college, I begin to not just read Morrison, but all kinds of other writers, Gloria Steinem, all these people. And so I begin to realize there's a world of imagination and people out there that are outside of my family, to go back to what you asked, Indira. So there's this world that I can explore through books, etc. And that's not to say I wasn't doing that as a child. I was a voracious reader, but undirected, right? Like just kind of consuming things, and directed by my family. But by this time, I'm exploring all kinds of new things. And Morrison, because her texts are so rich in texture, right? And so she's exploring so many things. And I'll give you one example. There are two things that Morrison does in her texts. One is she's very interested in lyricism and rhythmic movements. And so she actually has a text that's really based on jazz. And so coming from a musical family, right? And jazz is a science. And so looking at that text and unpacking it, I began to realize that, right, when we're talking about language is specific, and we have to think about not just the musicality but the words that we use, and how does that create who we are. One of my friends did her dissertation on forms. So how do you fill out forms? Because we get interpolated and made meaning. And so Morrison taught me about how we make meaning of the world through words. I
Wow.
think also what she taught me was about borders, because she would talk about migration and borders and war. And a lot of her books, even two of her books, are centered, the chapters around war. And so as I think about Morrison and the war, both, if you think about the Du Boisian concept of the war within, but also the wars across borders, and particularly for women who often find themselves, when war happens, they are the most maligned and the most exploited. And so she taught me a lot about how do we think about women and gender, and the exploitation that happens particularly in those borders and on those margins. If you think about The Bluest Eye, or the ways in which, right, these women sort of are portrayed in her text, and then how they overcome through friendship, right? We can think of Sula. So I think there are so many ways in which Morrison was so helpful to me as I grew older. And then I'll just say, I just want to drop a few other names. Gloria Anzaldúa, Winnie Mandela, who becomes so maligned when she's protecting her husband, Nelson. And we have to think about the various ways in which she was portrayed. Gayatri Spivak, right, and the subaltern, and the work that Spivak did in the 90s and 80s, and really opening the perception for me and the connections between Black British and South Asian British who came under the rubric of Blackness to really take action, as you all talked about, and did the nerve to take action together. So again, the world is before us. And I think about all these expats and all these people who bonded together, and they provided models, villages, and they're all friends. So now I think about, I'm friends with these people, Beverly Guy-Shiftal, Dr. Janetta B. Cole, Paula Giddings, When and When I Enter, and they're all friends. And I realize friendship, cohorts, togetherness, like the two of you, building capacity, acting together, we can be better together, and we can do it with love and compassion. And I think you are exactly right. Women have had to face different kinds of challenges. So that means we've had to develop different navigational skills. And Morrison demonstrates that in her text as well.
Wow. I wish I'm going to try to get a script of what you've said, because I have been fascinated with Toni Morrison, well, forever. My mother knew her mother because my mother was very active in the Black social community of Lorraine, which was it was a very segregated community,
Yes.
right? And my mother was a volunteer at the community center and started a Girl Scout troop. And Toni Morrison's mother ran that center. Now, here's what you may not know. Her name is not Toni Morrison. Chloe Wooford.
Chloe Wooford.
And my mother my mother has passed away, but to the day she died, she never called Toni Morrison Toni Morrison. She called her Chloe. And, seriously. But here's the funny thing, and we'll have to do this offline.
Yes.
But The Bluest Eye, which is her first book,
yes,
it takes place in Lorraine.
Yes.
It's all about Lorraine, my hometown.
Yes.
It takes place about the parks, Lakeview Park, which was a white park, Century Park, which was a black park. Her main character is this Black woman who takes care of a white child, right?
Yes.
Who has blue eyes.
Yes.
I mean, that's how I was introduced to her, because at the time, we had a Black woman who was helping my mother. She had 4 children, and she was taking care of me as a child. And I talk about weird messages. Now, I'm not as smart as you, Lisa. Her later books, I hardly understood. I couldn't would read them because I was forced to read them. But I didn't understand half of Sula, I never understood half of what she was talking about.
Martha, I say the spoon alone in Sula.
Exactly. So anyway, it's just so wonderful because I go back to Lorraine all the time. I still have people there. And there's
Yes.
a library that's named after her. But Lorraine is struggling. And it was just about 6 months ago I was back, and they're struggling economically. It's part of the Rust Belt,
Yeah.
steel town that's gone, broke. And I said to my brother and my sister who are there, you should build it around Toni Morrison. You should create a creative center where people come to learn creative writing. The Black community comes together. You hook with Oberlin College that has a
Yes,
huge Black history. You
it does.
create something that is beautiful on the lake. It's almost like the Banff Center for Study of Creative Arts. They thought I was crazy. They said, nobody in Lorraine will come. I said, we don't want people from Lorraine. We want
don't.
people from Sweden. We want people from Germany. We want people from Australia to come. They know about Toni Morrison. You might not know about Toni Morrison. Anyway.
That's so right. And Martha, I'll just add this. The reason Morrison is so important, to your point, is that it's Ohio, right? I never thought of Ohio as a border state. I never thought of Ohio, but I learned all these things. And particularly because I grew up in the North, right? In Cleveland, right. And then I learned later about the voting patterns to the South in Cincinnati and all of those things. And so those are the kinds of things that I learned over the course of my life. And I'm like, yes. And I have a dear friend, and she used to talk about flyover states, right? She's from the East Coast. And she was like, that darned Ohio, it matters so much because she studies voting patterns. And she's like, I can't get away from Ohio. And I'm like, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we share that.
Yes.
So,
okay.
Just to switch gears.
Yes.
Lisa, every leader, faces challenges. And you just talked about it, the struggles. That sometimes you look at leaders and think everything's easy. No. All leaders face challenges and have to deal with mistakes that they make. I read once that the biggest mistake you experienced, and I found this so interesting, was not having patience. That is, you move too quickly. I found this so interesting, as I am certainly not a patient person. I want to get things done. I make my lists. I want to get it off my agenda. I want to solve a problem. If it comes, I want to get it done. I want to solve it. I want to move as quickly as possible. I thought your observation that that's a liability when you cannot be patient enough to take the time to do the right thing was clearly very, very remarkable. Can you share with our listeners how you came to this realization and what you did? Because I listened to you. You've had to work at being patient, I assume. And why is this such an important lesson for leaders?
Thank you again for this question. It's so important, and I work at it every day. And we all make mistakes, so we have to work at things. And patience is something that often as young leaders, we are taking actions. And those actions, as I say, get us to where we are. And so as leaders, sometimes we think what got us here will take us to the next step. And sometimes we have to realize that what got us there may or may not get us there. And we have to think about what's around us and what's surrounding us. So I'm getting to the answer of how I learned this. Alfred Adler has a quote, and it's, quote, "We are all influenced by our past memories, but the question is whether we are prisoners of the past or whether we learn from our experiences," end quote. And so for me, it's about how do we learn from our experiences. And so for me, I made mistakes and I wasn't patient. And I was also drawing on experiences from the past that I thought would provide for the future. So I'll give you an example. I've worked for a lot of different institutions, but I'll give you three. Tufts, Harvard, you mentioned these, in NYU, and now Adler. So I like to refer to them as a giraffe, a bear, a panther, and a bumblebee. All animals, but very different animals, right? And so Tufts is an institution that's aspirational. Its neck is exposed. It's in Boston. It's reaching for the air, but it sits down the street from MIT and Harvard. Lots of people have never heard of Tufts. So it's still reaching for the leaves. When your neck is exposed, that's brand expansion, right? You're trying to go somewhere. And so in that way, you're working with an institution that may be reaching for something. Harvard is a bear. And if you've ever tried to move a bear, all right, that's 10, 15 people. Right? So you have to think about that, and you have to think about patients differently. And then if you're working at like an NYU, which is the Panther, NYU has campuses in Abu Dhabi and Paris and all the cities of the world. It's black, sleek, and moves in the night, right? And so all night, every night, all across the world. And then you have the bumblebee, Adler, pollinating small, undersized, defying gravity. Its wings, right, that are supposed to go up and down, but go side to side, right? And that is defying physics in terms of keeping itself afloat. And we do mental health. Adler defied Freud, which is kind of amazing, because to defy Freud at the time and be a breakaway thinker. So when I think about how we as leaders have to be more patient, we have to recognize difference, and we have to be patient and listen long enough to others to see those differences. So when I talked about the giraffe, the bear, the panther, and the bumblebee, when I went from the giraffe, Tufts, to the bear, I was still trying to use the giraffe methodology, right? And the bear was eating me alive. And then when I was trying to use the bear at the panther was moving so fast, I was still moving like a bear, slow. In fact, someone said, take those pearls off when I got to NYU. Right? And I didn't, and it was a metaphor, but it was take the pearls off, because that is a conservative approach. You're moving too slowly, right? So the first thing is, right, you have to listen. So empathy and listening and getting constructive feedback and being strong enough to hear the feedback, right? Lots of us, we get feedback, but we don't listen to the feedback, and we get defensive. We're like, yeah, okay, that's great for you. Thanks. Sure. And then we call our friends and we're like, oh, can you believe this person said this to me? They don't know me. They don't know what they're talking about. And I find that if it's bothering me enough to call a friend, that means I need to talk about it, and I need to listen, and I need to go inside. So my mantra is, if you call a friend and you're complaining about something that someone said to you, before you call the friend, spend 30 minutes writing down the cons and pros. What does it mean to you? Why are you so upset? What is the trigger in it? And figure out if there's a kernel where you can listen and be more patient with yourself, and then go into the conversation where you might be able to hear someone else.
Wisdom. Love the metaphors. Lots there. Fun. So diving into a somewhat challenging subject, you're well recognized for your support of diversity within a university campus, and you have consistently emphasized the need for sustained and persistent outreach to women and historically marginalized groups who can bring different perspectives and problem-solving skills to their jobs. Given the recent attack on DEI programs in the US and a lesser but still prevalent pushback on these initiatives in Canada, how should a university such as Adler proceed within this environment? And have you changed course?
Yes.
With respect to this priority, and how do you see new opportunities to pursue in this current climate?
Yes. So I think this goes back to actually some of the questions that you asked me earlier. I think leaders have to take a stand in moments of difficulty. And so when we're thinking about Adler, also we go back to our foundation. Adler was a breakaway thinker who said that we have to be in community if we are going to thrive better together. And so as a result, we are doubling down. Health differentials globally are steadily climbing. We know this from the Sustainable Development Goals, and we know that disparities globally continue, and disproportionately women and children are impacted by these disparities. And so at Adler, like I said, we're putting a stake in the ground. And so when I think about universities, I think what we have to do is think about collaboration first. Historically, universities, we have thought of ourselves as competitors. And so now we need to think of ourselves as collaborators. Research institutions, liberal arts institutions, what we call in the United States community colleges or community serving institutions, indigenous institutions, etc. How are we coming together intra-community? And then how are we thinking about multi-sector partnerships? Because global partnerships, government with industry, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples in a moment. But I think this is where universities, because we have lots of researchers, we have talents, but those talents need to be married with other talents. And historically, we've been a little isolationist in our university structures sometimes. And so how do we reimagine that? And I think if universities are just to thrive, we have to reimagine ourselves. There's this company that was called Blockbuster. And when I use this example for a lot of people who are over 40, they know what Blockbuster is. When I use it for people who are under 40, they've never heard of Blockbuster. And what I say is that higher education as a sector is ripe for disruption. And so we need to think about how we're going to thrive. And we've seen some of that in the pushback, as you described, against higher education. And so if you know your Blockbuster, what are you doing to really buttress yourself? And so I'm like, we need to be Redbox. We not Netflix yet. We need to be Redbox outside of 7-Eleven, $1.99, communicating, really doubling down with our community work and what I call in the glocal. So how are we doing that at Adler? We are partnering with the First Nations Health Authority here in Vancouver and really thinking about our work with Indigenous communities and how do we reimagine health and healing through a non-colonial project, right? And how do we infuse Indigenous health and healing practices as we're talking about trauma and mental health. Fulbright, we're partnering with Fulbright Canada because as you think about Fulbright fellows across the world, of course, the work that they do with trauma communities and how do we really work with them? So if you think about diversity and inclusion in those spaces globally, Fulbright is an organization that has really educated scholars and leaders. And so this partnership will allow us to, as I say, double down on our work, leveraging British Columbia, and of course, Vancouver. I'm sitting in Vancouver right now, and I'm excited to be here. But part of, I think, what this gives us is when we think about the Pacific and access to the Pacific, some of the work even with First Nations communities, as we go out to Australia and New Zealand, etc. There are global Indigenous communities, and we are expanding the work there, and also this work in trauma as we think about governments like Barbados that have put into their governmental practice and have a new ministry focused on mental health. So there's so much work that we can do in this space. And I think, again, as I was talking about Adler, we just have to break away, I think, from some of the traditions of higher education and reimagine ourselves in these global conversations. I'll end this by saying that when I think about universities and universities that are changing who they are, I think that we might have to change, but it's not to be reactive to the moment. It's to be proactive for the future. And so we should be working in concert with one another, but also with Generation X. And yes, those alphas and those betas, they have a lot to say. And so we also need to think about how we're engaging in these trans and intergenerational conversations, which are really challenging. But if we're going to think about the future of education, not just the critiques from quote unquote the conservative or the however we kind of think about this, but the critiques that are from the generations that are emerging. And how are we incorporating, for instance, AI? How are we incorporating thinking about job and workforce development? And these are real questions that emerging generations have. And I think that's when I say Blockbuster, that's the red box part. How do we integrate these new generations into the work that we're doing, whether it's curriculum development, university management, and the like?
You know, Lisa, I love your kind of analysis of how universities need to seize if what some people would call the challenge of the moment and turn it into an opportunity. And I love your kind of sense that we've got to move from being competitors to collaborators and your whole idea of partnerships. The one question I would ask, though, it seems to me all the examples you gave are with kind of like-minded partners, that we all agree on, what social justice is. And we all agree that, the moral way to do something. To me, one of the challenges that universities, the raw nerve that has been exposed is we've kind of been guilty of not including the opposite views in our partnerships. And so I would love to think of an Adler being kind of the, as you say, the bumblebee, the new kid on the block, the freedom of being a private versus public, with a very specific agenda that we might see Adler reaching out to some of the more conservative right-wing groups to partner, to try to bring those two voices together in a way that our new generation of leaders not necessarily embrace that view, but understand it and aren't fearful of it and don't feel they have to fight it and understand that we have to work together. Is that a possibility?
That is absolutely right, Martha. And one of our programs is actually on the military. And people are very critical of the military, for instance. We also have a program on sports, right? And again, thinking about engagement of different kinds of people across different perspectives. And I think you're exactly right. Actually, I was recently on the board of my undergraduate institution, and at that institution, they have engaged in a dialogue process because this is an undergraduate institution. So they brought actually people who are doing dialogue to think about how do you actually have dialogue across difference and fundamental differences. And I learned a lot by being on that board. Now I'm at a graduate institution, right? But how do we educate leaders to think about how do you bring difference? And so one of the things we're going to do is we're going to create a global leadership institute so people can come and learn about how to do things differently, how to collaborate across these differences. Tourism and the military, and what's been so interesting and lost in part of these conversations, one of the greatest supporters of diversity, equity, and inclusion was the military in the United States. Right, a conservative by nature, in many people's opinion, right, organization. But we couldn't have the conversation because we couldn't get past, right, the sort of face of it. And that's where I think you're right, that we need to engage, right, in deeper conversations. And I do think that Adler, we're poised to do that. I'll give you one other concrete example. When we think about gender, for instance, a lot of the conversation has been on girls and women. And I think that is an important conversation and the differential impacts. And also, we have to talk about boys and we have to talk about men. And when we look at boys and the mental health crises that are happening, there's a boy crisis. There is a global boy crisis. It's not just in the United States or Canada. It's manifesting itself differentially in different places. I spent time in the Middle East. Like I said, I just got back from Stockholm in Europe. We can talk about in Africa, but how boys understand themselves or don't understand themselves, how they're interpreted through media, the gaming industry, and all of the ways in which that is magnifying, whether it's masculinity and or femininity, and all the in-between, right, and the gender evolution that we've seen. There is so much there. And if we just approach it through left-right arguments, we're not going to get into the nuances. And the reality is our boys and our men, sometimes they're not being served well. And we need to really get into the depth of those conversations and the mental health issues. And I'm not talking about, when we talk about mental health, sometimes there's still that stigma of, kind of the mad woman or mad man. That's not what I mean. Mental health is a spectrum where I'm really talking about wellness and wholeness. And that is where we really want our men and our boys to be whole and well as much as we want our girls. And that also is a collaboration. And I don't think we've paid enough attention to it. And at Adler, we have a gender and sexuality studies program. So we're, as I said, putting a stake in the ground and doubling down.
Indira, you have to share with Lisa your experience on that whole question of boys.
I would say that's now 15 years ago. I was asked by a journalist about the fact that there were more women enrolled at University of Alberta versus men. And what did I think about that? And I said, it's a problem. I said, we've been worrying about female enrollment and now they've overtaken them and no one is saying anything about male enrollment. And I said, I'm going to stand up for white men because I can. My goodness, I was pilloried. I was asked to resign. The women went after me. And if I was a male who had said that, I would have been forced to resign. I mean, they couldn't take me out because, anyway. So you're right. I think the time is overdue to have the conversation. And I think
it is far overdue.
On DEI is largely white men feeling that DEI agenda has devalued them. So
and that's the nuance, right? And I'll just slice this way. If you look at not just the mental health issues, but the differentiation among white males, even in economic enfranchisement and disenfranchisement, the use of drugs, right? It's right? We have not delved into this, and you're exactly right. The pushback, and to your point, both of your points, we have emerging generations. And so the questions that I often get asked are, will emerging generations follow the patterns in terms of masculinity? Well, they're not poised to do so. Research shows they're not poised to do so. But if they continue to feel disenfranchised, disillusioned, not part of society, not part, as Adler talks about, feeling like they don't belong, then we will see, and I think even exacerbated conditions, right? And so that's where I think we have to think about interventions in some real tactical ways that we haven't done historically.
So takes leadership. And a recent article on leadership, you identify 5 traits you believe effective leaders must exhibit. They're not typical traits like, consultation, team building, strategic visioning, etc., which are being often the traits that people say you need to have to lead. But your list includes a very different set of traits. They include empathy, courage and creativity, integrity and humility, accountability and communication, adaptability and resilience. Quite the list. So might you share with us how you developed this list and why you think they represent a new style of leadership?
Well, this goes back to the global work and maybe even back to my family. I think that one of the things about being surrounded by so many people who were so different, and I raised as you in Ohio in a place called Shaker Heights. There's actually a movie called The Battle of Shaker Heights, and it's about diversity and these diverse people who were put together in kind of an experiment, and it worked to some degree. But the reality is, what that showed me, and I think gave me an appetite for it, was as being a curious person. And so then I would go out and explore the world. And as a result, what I was to learn was that early on was to learn of this person by the name of Robert Greenleaf. And he would talk about servant leadership and what it means to be a servant leader. This is kind of the work of people like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, right? And so that kind of servant leader. And so early on, I would say, and particularly as a woman, this was really strong. I really identified with this in service of others. And so then when you think about that, that's the empathetic part, to have enough humility to enter into spaces where you can see others. And that was really important in terms of the global space, right? I found that as traveling as an American with that blue passport, while it's great sometimes, it also means that people read you in certain ways. And as a Black person, I didn't know that being in America because I was read as a Black person in America. But then when I went outside of America, I was read as American sometimes with all of the goodness and badness associated with that. And so as a result, I started to think about these ideas of humility and empathy and listening. And how do you listen, especially as an American, when you're in Cuba or when you're in Mexico or when you're in India, and the perceptions of Americans, right? And I admit I was reluctant initially because I had my own experiences of America. I think that also these courage, creativity, accountability, and communication. So what I would learn later as I would go on in my leadership path is that I'm an introvert. And so being an introvert, the listening part was easy for me. But the courage part was not always easy because I'm not an extrovert, right? So my greatest superpower is observation. And so I had to learn how to be an extrovert. And this is where the servant leader piece came to be, because I realized if I were acting on the behalf of others, I could be an extrovert all day, every day. If I were fighting for the rights of others, I would get in the line of fire anytime, anywhere. And that's because of my background and family. And so when I think about adaptability and resilience, you have to learn how adaptable you are and how resilient you are. And I say this because I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and they have these new ministries that they created, the Ministry of Possibility, the Ministry of Happiness. And I say the ministry I would create is the Ministry of Mistakes, Recovery, and Resilience. How do you make mistakes? How do you recover fast? How are you resilient? And how do you communicate that? And I think then we as leaders could learn about those processes of recovery, of resilience, of adaptability. The last thing I'll say about this is recently was just at these conferences on AI, and one of them was an AI immersion, so all of the possibilities of AI. And the second conference I went to, which was in Stockholm, was AI and humanity. And so as I think about this idea of artificial intelligence, and particularly we think about leadership, right? And the intersection of leadership for the future, because the leadership of the future, we have to think about technology. And so I was on a panel talking about this idea of humanity and how do we lean into humanity as we think about technology and development. And so as leaders, I think we do have to be courageous because we have to learn. And technology is scary and frightening. I want to be honest, I am a more seasoned leader, which means that I, during part of this AI, learned that the number one use of AI for people under the age of 28 is for companionship and therapy. Boyfriends, girlfriends, companionship, etc. That was very disconcerting for someone like me, of a different generation. So there are lots of ways I could enter into that conversation, but how I'm entering into it is listening and having the courage to understand that there may be something very different than myself. And how do we bring the humanity into this? Because what we know about emerging generations is they may be digital natives, but they may not be digitally sophisticated. And so how do we cross those generations? And so as I think about leadership and servant leadership, again, to go back to that, sometimes when we think about service, it's service of self. And we have to, again, think about service of others. And sometimes those emerging generations, service of others is really hard and challenging. And it's really about curiosity and learning. And I say I am a beta in the making, right? The betas have been born. I am joining them right now. And we're going to try all kinds of new things. And that's what it means to be a beta. So here we are.
Amazing. When I read your list of 5 traits, I just found them so fascinating because we've all read our leadership manuals, and I don't think anybody has identified these traits as being essential, and so it's quite remarkable. And I love your ministry of mistakes, adaptability, resilience. I mean, who would have thought that this kind of organizational behavior is so critical in moving us forward. So, Lisa, in closing, we are extraordinarily grateful to you. I can't tell you how I've been just fascinated with your interpretation of life, leadership, experience, listening, humility, all of those things, servant leadership, all of that. And so thank you for sharing with us your stories and experience. Adler is truly one of Canada's most interesting and innovative universities. And to have you at the helm at this particular time is extremely reassuring. One of the questions our listeners might be interested in exploring with you as we say goodbye is, how does a leader steer an institution such as Adler that has a specific mandate in these tumultuous times, when many of the objectives Adler supports, such as social justice and equity and inclusion, are clearly under attack, okay? And you've talked about this throughout your interview, but how do you defend the principles you stand for, while at the same time, and I think this is the interesting piece of it, acknowledging that some of the criticisms of liberal institutions may have some merit? In other words, we may have cooked our own goose to some extent. Do universities need to change, or do we just carry on by defending our past and our founding principles? And you've talked about this already, but any words of wisdom you might share as we face this unknown future?
Absolutely. I'm going to return to a quote by Adler. And Adler has a quote that says, quote, "Trust only movement. Life happens at the level of events, not of words. Period. Trust movement," end quote. And so we have to move, right? That's the thing, is that stagnation in many, many ways. And I remember when I first went into Harvard University, and there was a woman, her name is Clayton Spencer. And Clayton Spencer goes on to become the president of Bates College in Maine. And one of the things that Clayton would say early on as I entered into that institution, and she would talk about dinosaurs and how dinosaurs became extinct. And we have to move to not become the dinosaurs. That doesn't mean, but that movement has to be in concert and collaboration. And so as I think about universities, you're exactly right. We can't stay as we were. That goes back to when I said even leaders think that what got us there will keep us there. And what we know about universities and the evolution of universities, and we're seeing this globally, the birth of new universities, the closing of some, the mergers, etc. And so we have to be proactive in thinking about the work that we do. And also, Martha, I think this is really, really, really important. We have to acknowledge the mistakes. And if we don't, because if we do not acknowledge some of the mistakes that we've made along the way, as leaders in higher education, we cannot rebuild trust. And so when we talk about emerging generations and young people, this is really where a lot of the work in higher education, we have a lot of professors. And what I like to say is we like to profess, but sometimes we don't like to learn. And so as learning institutions, we need to bring some of that learning back into our institutions. And a lot of that is the reciprocity and the process, whether it's our graduate students and even sometimes our undergraduate institutions. And so I think that's just really important. And we have to embrace, there's a concept, a Canadian concept that came out during this trouble between, as we think about what's happening right now. It's called elbows out. And if we want thriving communities, we need to have institutions and leaders who are willing to have their elbows out, but not just to each other, but elbows out to stand for something. And I think that's, we at Adler are standing for the future, a future of possibility and engaging. And what I often say about Adler is we are here to deliver on the promise of education for our students and the investment of the future for our alumni. And I'm reminded of a quote by Leanne Simpson, and she's the author of As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance. And I just want to read a quote from her because she's one of my favorite authors in contemporary moment. And she writes, quote, "The fact that I'm here today is a miracle because it means my family, like every Indigenous family, did whatever they could to ensure that I survived the past 400 years of violence. For my to survive and flourish the next 400 years, we need to join together in a rebellion of love, persistence, and commitment, and profound caring, and create constellations of co-resistance, working together toward a radical alternative present based on deep reciprocity and the gorgeous generative refusal of colonial recognition." And so I think we can be better together. We can find the right partners. And as June Jordan said, we are the ones we have been waiting for. And I believe at Adler, and we're working with people like you, Indira, and Martha, and others, we are the ones. We're here, and we can make significant change. And I hope others will join us as we develop even more partnerships in Vancouver, Chicago, and beyond. Great.
Thank you.
Thank
So,
you.
in closing, let me say, we really admire you. My goodness, what you stand for and how you've expressed it and your leadership. You played a remarkable role in so many institutions and advancing women, and truly in many really remarkable ways. So your stories recounted here will really serve as an inspirational example for thousands of women who we hope will listen to this podcast.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. I mean, of giving of yourself and your authenticity. Your background is so incredibly interesting but relevant to all of the young people that are going to follow you. You know, having leaders that people can actually look up to and aspire to be and to give examples, I think is extremely important, and particularly in today's world where young people seem to be confused. So thank you so much for sharing with us and giving of your time and your expertise.
Thank you.
That was amazing. My word, there was so much there. Hard to distill, or do justice, I think, to her real breadth of thinking on many of the topics. But I really loved her metaphors of different institutions. That was just so vivid and captivating. Harvard as the bear and Adler as the bumblebee. I think those are great metaphors for how to, and not just in her case, she was talking about patience, but I think in terms of leading, to understand the place that you're leading and to think about what kind of a creature you've got. So I thought that was amazing.
We hear that often from other women, that knowing the institution you're in and being the leader the institution needs rather than the leader that you may want to be, I think is a critical message. One of the things that came through consistently in her her responses was the issue of listening and hearing. And I loved her quote that said, "You need to be strong enough to hear the feedback you're getting."
Right.
You know, it's one thing to seek feedback. We've all done that. It's another to actually hear it
Mhm.
and to try to understand it, because I've learned the hard way. It's hard to hear. It's hard. And so it's so easy to discount it and to defend yourself and say they don't really understand. And yet what I think we've all learned kind of through our own mistakes is that often there's something in that feedback that you need to know
Mhm.
and you need to accept. And that's really what she was talking about in terms of patience.
So, in closing, we want to thank you again for listening to this episode of She's Got Nerve. If you enjoyed tuning in, then please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share this conversation with your friends.
Go to www.nerve2021.com or follow our social media channels at NerveBook 2021 to find out more about women in leadership and to access some useful resources.
And if there are any specific topics you would like us to cover in the future, then please email nervebook2021@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you.
And a very special thanks to our team, marketing manager and producer Orla Mackerline and show manager Eilish Courtney.